while we're awaiting the answer to item number 2, Mr. Clerk, can we please skip over that for now? And would you please call item number 3?
Yes, item number 3 is an ordinance amending the municipal election codes to require the director of elections to submit information documenting the city's intended open source voting pilot program to the California Secretary of State on behalf of the Board of Supervisors and upon approval of the Secretary of State to implement such a system for use at the November 8th, 2022 elections. Members of the public who wish to provide public comment on this item should call 415-655-0001. The meeting ID is 2493-746-7581. Then press pound and pound again. If you haven't already done so, please dial *3 to line up to speak. And just to note, there is a request that items 2 and 3 be sent out as committee reports.
I am aware. President Walton, this item has also been brought to this committee by yourself. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Peskin. And again, I am back. This one is another very simple item I have before you to authorize an open source voting pilot in San Francisco. This legislation will allow the Department of Elections to submit a pilot for review with the Secretary of State. As you all know, the board has tried previously for over the past 15 years to push for an open source voting system, and we're very close. You know, we've been an innovative leader when it comes to setting standards for fair and transparent elections, and this will also allow us to continue to do that. So I'm requesting this item also be sent as a committee report, and I'd like to thank Elections Director John Arntz for moving forward with this project, Elections Commissioner Chris Jerdonek and Trent Lange, the Director of California Clean Money Campaign for their advocacy on this and organizing the community support throughout California's system, Deputy City Attorney Ana Flores for helping us draft this legislation, and my Chief of Staff, Natalie G. Thank you, Chair Peskin.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from committee members? This thing has been kicking around this institution as long as I've been kicking around this institution. All right. Why don't we go to general public comment? Are there members of the public who would like to comment on this item number 3 related to open source voting?
Yes, we are checking to see if there are any callers in the queue. If you've not already done so, please press *3 to be added to the queue to speak. For those already on hold, please continue to wait until the system indicates you have been unmuted and you may begin your comment. It appears we have 7 callers in line to speak at this time.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Does raising your hand on Microsoft Teams put you in the queue?
No.
Please note that public comment is through call-in only. You should not be on Microsoft Teams for public comment. Again, the public comment line to call for public comment is 415-655-0001. The meeting ID is 2493-746-7581. Then press pound and pound again. And then you can press *3 to be added to the line to speak. Mr. Atkins, can we have the first public commenter, please?
Good morning. My name is Alec Bash, and I'm calling in support of this ordinance, and I want to express my appreciation to the president of the board for sponsoring it, and to the other co-sponsors, and to Chair Peskin for his having continued with this for so many years now. I've been involved with this issue from the outset. I don't need to take a lot of time to tell you how important this is and how beneficial this will be for San Francisco to proceed with this. I will not get into substance because I know there are so many speakers in line, so I just want to thank you for going forward with this, which I believe the committee intends to do. Thank you, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Bash. Next speaker, please.
Thank you, committee members. Good morning. My name is CJ Coles. I am with the organization Verified Voting, a national nonprofit with a mission to strengthen democracy for all voters by promoting the responsible use of technology in elections. And my comments are likewise brief this morning. We support this legislation. We appreciate President Walton for bringing this forward and others that have been involved in crafting this legislation and pushing for this for many years within San Francisco. Open source voting is a good idea generally for transparency. Not that all of you need to necessarily hear that, because you know that. It is worthwhile mentioning that open source voting is not sufficient alone for security. There are other safeguards that should be in place, including robust post-election auditing, risk-limiting audits after an election is concluded. But restoring trust, instilling trust in elections and outcomes of elections through piloting this open source voting project certainly will be paramount. And we support this idea and hope it receives a favorable report to the full board and a favorable vote from the full board tomorrow. So again, appreciate this coming forward, and Verified Voting supports it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Thank you to the members of the Rules Committee for discussing this ordinance today. My name is Matt Rowe, and I'm speaking on behalf of VotingWorks, the nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that would be providing the hardware, software, and services for the proposed open source voting pilot. VotingWorks is the only nonprofit voting system vendor and the only open source voting system deployed in the United States elections today. We also develop and implement Arlo, our open source risk limiting auditing software, which is used by 10 states, including California, where it's the only tool approved by the California Secretary of State for counties to conduct post-election audits to confirm election outcomes. I originally submitted a letter in September last year to the Board of Supervisors, Elections Commission, and Director of Elections, indicating that we would be interested in servicing an open source voting system pilot at no cost to San Francisco. I have since attended multiple Elections Commission meetings and worked with Director of Elections John Arntz to determine a pilot plan that best fits San Francisco. The specifics of this plan are represented by this ordinance, where we will provide the equipment and implementation services for voters to use our accessible ballot marking device in the City Hall Voting Center. Most recently, I worked with Director Arntz to draft use procedures for the pilot program for the Secretary of State to start the regulations process for open source voting systems in California per the Secretary of State's November request. I'm also coordinating with the Mayor's Disability Council to ensure that we incorporate the feedback of San Francisco voters with accessibility needs into our system. I want to thank the San Francisco Election Commission for their support to date, Board of Supervisors President Walton for introducing this legislation, and Director of Elections John Arntz for his partnership in defining this pilot program. Thank you again for your time and consideration. I'm available to answer any questions regarding VotingWorks, our technology, or the specifics of this pilot program if you may have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for... No, I see no questions. All right, why don't we, and Mr. Oranger, we already dealt with your item. You have been recommended to the full board, so I see you trying to get in, but we've already dispensed with item number 1. Why don't we move on to the next caller?
Hello, Supervisors. Trent Lange, President of California Clean Money Campaign, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization with over 100,000 supporters in California. We've been very pleased and grateful to work with President Walton on this pilot project, as well as Commissioner Jerdonek in the Secretary of State office, to ensure that the regulations are in place in time for this pilot project to go to help San Francisco fulfill its long-term goals to move to open source voting systems. The Board of Supervisors has long taken leadership in the movement to have more secure and transparent elections with open source voting systems. It's been a very long road. You even allocated, which we're very grateful for, initial funding to help develop the system. But now it's extra exciting that VotingWorks has come through and designed and built a very strong looking open source system, so the county doesn't have to spend the millions of dollars to build its own, which this pilot project would help to approve and give the more transparent elections that people want, as well as huge cost savings for the city. We're also especially excited about this because once it's proven here in San Francisco and then certified, then the whole state and even the whole nation will be able to use the system. So very excited about this opportunity. Thank you all for your support. Thank you, Supervisor Mandelman, for coming on as a co-sponsor, and let's help California lead the nation for more transparent and less costly elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, supervisors. My name is Brent Turner. I'm here today representing some folks that I don't know if they're going to be able to show up on the call, but I've been speaking with former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, as well as a fellow by the name of Dr. Juan Gilbert, who is very well known in this particular space. And also, I want to, just in case Alan Deckert doesn't show up, I want to just give our full support for this work and thank everybody involved. I do have to mention that back in 2004, when Alan Deckert first demonstrated this kind of system with open source, we were soon to present into San Francisco. And I think around 2006, this work actually started up and then later was carried by Tom Amiano, Chris Daly, Scott Weiner, and many others, Raphael Mendelman and others that were involved. I really also have to thank Chris Jerdonek and someone who spoke earlier, Trent Lange, for carrying the ball here in San Francisco with the public and making sure that this didn't go dark on us. Obviously, it's of the utmost importance. VotingWorks is able to fill the role that we need right now of providing the trial system, and it's just a great day for the county, and we look forward to seeing this more prevalent throughout the United States. So thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Next speaker, please.
Hello, my name is Kim Soper. I'm with the National Voting Rights Task Force, and I have been speaking in favor of open source since 2005. We need this. We need this not just to look at the source code, although some source code that has been used in California and across the country was written by Mr. Elder, who had 23 convictions for embezzlement, and that's scary. So we need to be able to look at the source code, and beyond that, we need to know who wrote it. If you go open source, you're likely to have a record of who wrote what line of code. And beyond that, there are data files, log files of who logged in, who used the password, who made this phone call from the machine if that was done. There's just a lot of log files that we have not yet been able to get access to, and by making it open source, we will have a much more transparent election, and the public will have a much better idea of what's going on. And the final point is this will impact, this little pilot will impact election systems over the decades across California, and because it's open source, across the country. And our elections are really being challenged, and we need to make everything as transparent as possible, everywhere as fast as possible. So I urge your support for this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hey, I'm Coyote Marin. You just voted to reappoint me to this Sweat-Free Procurement Advisory Group. It happens that my day job is in software, and I actually maintained an open source project for 10 years. I just want to say code is law. Like source code that can, that counts votes, it's making decisions, it's making government decisions, and those decisions are properly in the hands of elected officials and the public. So for example, in San Francisco, we passed ranked choice voting, and we were limited to 3 choices on ranked choice voting, not because of a decision by a public official, but because the vendor said they couldn't do more than 3. And that's really not acceptable, and that's the danger of entrusting code that handles something as important as voting to a private entity. So I'm hoping that this is part of a sea change in how we think about government and software, and that we move more software that makes government decisions into open source and into the hands of the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hello, my name is David Schmidt, and I'm a longtime volunteer for the California Clean Money Campaign and a resident of San Francisco. I'm commenting in support of this legislation. I want to thank Board President Walton for introducing it and Committee Member Mandelman for co-sponsoring it. The pilot project for November is a great opportunity because San Francisco won't need to spend millions of dollars to develop its own open source voting system, because the San Francisco-based nonprofit VotingWorks has developed the first complete open source system used in U.S. elections, and we can use it. So let's go and do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good morning, committee members and President Walton. My name is Chris Jerdonek. I've been the board's appointee to the Elections Commission for the past 8 years. I've also been leading the commission's efforts on open source voting for the past 7. In 2014, I worked with Supervisor Wiener's office on his open source voting legislation, and now I'm working closely with President Walton's office on today's legislation. So I want to thank President Walton and Natalie G. for their work, Committee Member Mandelman for co-sponsoring, and Director Arns for his work. Since 2015, the Commission has had a policy for the department to work towards adopting open source voting. The board's support goes back even farther to 2007 with Supervisor Tom Amiano. I know Chair Peskin, you presided over many of those hearings, and Committee Member Mandelman also authored a resolution in 2019 to support state open source voting legislation by Assembly Member Chu and Senator Wiener. Before today's legislation, efforts were focused on the city developing its own open source system. In 2018, the board allocated $1.25 million to start that development, but that money was taken away during the pandemic and never restored. Fortunately, during that time, the nonprofit VotingWorks was able to develop an open source system on its own. I first discussed the idea for a pilot with Director Arns in mid-September. In mid-October, the commission president and I met with him to let him decide the pilot's size and scope, and that's why the pilot is limited to accessible ballot marking devices at City Hall. The commission discussed the pilot at its September, October, November, and December meetings, and VotingWorks was also in attendance at those meetings to answer questions. At our December meeting, the commission voted unanimously to support this legislation, so we ask you to support it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your constant and continual work on this matter. Are there any other members of the public for public comment on this item?
I believe we have one more caller in the queue to speak.
Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Carla Kincaid-Yoshikawa. I'm a resident of San Francisco, a constant voter, and a volunteer with the California Clean Money Campaign for many years now. I worked years ago when we were out pounding the pavement, gathering signatures to get support for a pilot project a few years ago to do a trial vote, open source voting process. And one of the things that really impressed me was whenever I would approach someone who turned out to be working in the tech industry, I hardly had to say more than open source voting system before I got their full attention and their enthusiastic support, because they, more than the general public, understood immediately the advantages and security involved in open source voting. It's more important now than ever that we can rebuild the trust that people have in our voting systems, that we have secure voting systems, and that we have the transparency that will support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any last speaker or speakers? Mr. Young.
Just one last check. Just waiting for indications. That completes our caller list for public comment.
All right, public comment Item number 3 is closed. President Walton.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Peskin. And thank you to everyone who called in so we can move forward with this pilot and, of course, get to the transparency that we all seek when it comes to voting. And I, again, just appreciate everyone who worked on this with us and would love for this to go in as a committee report.
All right, on a motion made by myself to send this item with recommendation as a committee report, Mr. Young, a roll call, please.
Yes, on that motion, Supervisor Chan.
Aye.
Chan, aye. Vice Chair Mandelman.
Aye.
Mandelman, aye. Chair Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. The motion passes without objection to recommend the matter as a committee report.
All right, let's circle back to item number 2, President Walton.